Welcome to the second film in this series about historical runes and rune magic. My name is Alban from NORTHAN Viking Silver, and in this film I want to cover where the runes come from, when are they being used, who's using them, and what are they using them for. Okay, this is part one, and there'll be a second part because Rachel said this bit was too long and I was getting really boring, so we needed to cut it into two films. So that's what we're doing. So, to begin, runes are a Germanic alphabet. They're found pretty much wherever the Germanic peoples settled. So that means as far north as Greenland, as far south as Greece, west over to Ireland, east into Russia, wherever they settled or sometimes just travelled, they took the runes with them. When did all this start? How old are the oldest finds? Well, the oldest finds come from the 2nd century CE, from Denmark. Runes were probably developed for scratching on wood. We can guess this because the forms of the runes are vertical staves and diagonals. And that's because they cut across the grain of the wood. If you think about flattening a piece of wood, carving a rune stick so you can carve runes into it, you flatten the stick off, and if you cut downwards or diagonal, you cut across the grain, which is easier. So they're developed for cutting into wood, but wood doesn't survive very well in the archaeological record. So in fact, our oldest inscriptions are scratched into metal or bone and sometimes stone. I mean, later on we do have pieces of wood with runes in, but that's later in the Middle Ages. Now I'm talking about the earliest inscriptions. Okay, so I'm losing my place in my notes. Let me just find it. So this asks the first question I want to look at is, when did the Germanic tribes actually first invent the runes and where did they come from? So writing's already been around at this time for several thousand years. It starts in Mesopotamia in 3000 years BCE with cuneiform, and then this develops into other writing systems. So the Greeks develop a writing system and an alphabet. The Phoenicians, who were the great traders in the ancient world, they had an alphabet and they're spreading it as they travel around. And in northern Italy, before the rise of the Roman Empire, when it's just starting off in northern Italy, we have the Etruscans, and they develop an alphabet as well, probably from the Phoenicians. And then during this time, the Roman Empire grows up and the Romans invent the Latin alphabet, which is actually the one we're still using today. So somewhere from these different alphabets, Roman or Greek or Etruscan or Phoenician, the Germanic tribes get the idea to make the runes. How do we know this? Because the forms of some of the runes are similar or follow the forms of some of these classical alphabets. We don't know which one it was, but we just have to work with these different theories. Okay, so the classical world is a great influence on the Germanic tribes. The tribes are living on the borders of this world and they're absorbing this influence. They love classical stuff, as the archaeologists can tell us. They love the Roman gold, they love the weapons, they love the wine. I mean, Roman luxury goods are the business. And whilst they're picking all this stuff up, who knows what other things are influencing them. So the runes have come from one of these classical neighbours, but if you think about it for a moment, the runes are actually very different. They don't follow the ABC order of the classical alphabets. They start with F, U, Th, A, R, K, which spells Futhark, why we call it a Futhark. So they make their own order, and also the forms of the runes, even though they're used over a large space of time and a huge geographical area, these forms stay really similar, which I would say means that the runes were very special and important to the Germanic peoples and their culture. Doesn't matter that they picked up the idea from someone else, they make the runes very much their own. So the next question I want to deal with is, how long are runes used for? What about Ralph Blum's hint that there's actually an unbroken runic tradition all the way from our ancient ancestors up until the modern day? Well, let's have a look at that. So, as I said, the earliest finds come from 2nd century CE, Common Era, from Denmark. So there's a place called Illerup in Jutland, and in the 2nd century there's a massive battle between two tribes, and the victorious tribes takes all the war gear from their fallen enemies and they hurl it into their sacrificial bog as a sacrifice. And 2 millennia later, the archaeologists have dug up this stuff, and some of it has our earliest runic inscriptions. So that's the earliest stuff, and then after that, the use of runes spreads across Europe as the Germanic tribes themselves spread. So we have some finds from, let's say, 3rd to 6th century, from modern day countries like Germany, France, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Romania and Bosnia, a very wide area, but not so many inscriptions. And then by the 6th century, in mainland Europe, these inscriptions die out. It's because the Latin alphabet, with the culture of the Roman Church, is taking over and runes fall into disuse. But there is one area outside of Scandinavia where runes are still being used, and that's Anglo Saxon England and Frisia. Frisia is like the coast of modern day Germany and the Netherlands, and that's just across the North Sea from Great Britain. And there's a culture that's taking place here as these peoples contact each other with boats across water, because it's easier to travel across water than it is to travel across land. And in this small area, runes are still in use, and they're using them for church monuments like crosses, for memorials. They're putting them on coins. We have a few extraordinary items, like there's this fantastic sax blade pulled out of the River Thames, and all along its blade is inscribed and inlaid the runic alphabet, the Futhark. We also have runes from this area scratched on brooches. We have a few finger rings and funeral urns. So runes are still being used by the Anglo-Frisians, but they too, in the 9th century, they just abandon them, they fall into disuse, and the Latin alphabet takes over. So, by this time, there's only one place where runes are alive and kicking, and that's in Scandinavia. And here they're really flourishing. But a strange thing happens about this time. A strange thing for us to think about, because we're used to using our 26th letter Futhark, 26 letter alphabet, and these earlier inscriptions are in 24 letter Futhark. Now, as I said earlier, these runes stay pretty much the same in form, even though they're used over time and over a large area. But during this time, languages themselves are changing. So the sounds of the runes are changing as the languages change. So let me give you an example. So a rune that's around in the 3rd century, used by a tribe in the 3rd century, hundreds of years later, that tribe may not even exist anymore, or their language itself has changed. Let me give an example. This is the 15th rune, okay? And in the oldest use of the Futhark, that represents a Z sound. When you get into the Anglo-Frisian area, it's become an X, and later peoples are using it to represent an R sound. So the sound values of the runes are changing, even if the form of the runes stays the same. Now I want to talk about vowel changes. Before I get into vowel changes, I need a sip of tea. So this is the bit that says Rachel says it's really boring, but pay attention, it's fascinating. over time, vowels, the sounds of vowels changes. Think about our modern language today. Think about modern English. How much has our language changed in the last 700 years? A lot. Try reading Chaucer now and see how things have changed. Well, this is the time period we're talking about of the use of the runes from the 3rd century into the Middle Ages. It's a long time period. Sounds change. Now, take modern English. We have different pronunciations for different vowels, just according to which dialect or accent we're using. So you've got Southern English A in grass, pronounced grass. In Northern English, that would be grass. Or you've got Southern English butter, which in Northern English would be butter. So we've got different pronunciations in different dialects. Now imagine if we didn't have a school system with a spelling system, we didn't have a broadcasting network, and we're all trying to write things down the way that we speak. It would be a spelling nightmare. But this is what's happening to the runes in this period. Everyone's just writing them down the way they speak. This is the runologist's nightmare. But it's also their fascination. It's why they do it. Because sometimes these inscriptions are the only thing that's left of a lost language, and it tells them the form that the language was in. But it also means it's a very specialist subject. Anyway, back to that strange change that happens around the year 800. So the Anglo-Frisians are using 24 runes. In fact, they even add a few extra runes in as it helps them with their spelling system or the pronunciation. So sometimes there are even 29 runes or 33. But the Scandinavians, they think it's a good idea to cut the runes down to 16. That sounds crazy to us because we're used to being able to write, but for them, they thought it was a good idea. They must have thought it was good because runes are flourishing. They set up rune stones all over the place, and moving into the medieval period, the Norwegian merchants are writing messages on rune sticks. We have hundreds of them left from this time. So the Scandinavians continue to use the runes in the Viking Age, by which I mean 8th to 11th century. Then the Norwegian merchants are using them up until 1500. But then they fall out of use, and the Latin alphabet finally takes over. So that's a brief gallop through the development of runes from the beginning of their history right up until they fall into disuse. In the next film, I'm going to look at how Germanic culture went underground and then surfaced again into the modern day. See you then.